Good evening to those who are joining us from India. Good morning to those west of us, and perhaps a good night almost for those east of us. Welcome to IIT ACB's webinar series. Today we have another interesting topic, which has to do with the success of every country. It is said that without energy, there can be no or little development. And as a large nation, we really do need a lot of energy to keep this country going and growing in an effort to become Atmanirbhar, which is the national aspiration today. Energy is also not just about generating power. It's about uh, you know what kinds of powers do we generate? I mean, are we talking renewable? Are we talking hydrogen fuel cells? Are we talking fossil fuels? And everything has a plus and a minus. You also need to be aware that we don't damage the environment more than it's already damaged in our quest for consuming energy. There's an issue of transmission and load management across the country. Of course, it's got to be economical, and in a larger sense, it has to be sustainable. So India has always been on this quest for energy security. I mean, we've been dependent on imports of fossil fuels for a very long time. But over the last few years, we've started to generate a fair amount of renewable energy. So where does this take us is the big question ahead of us. Delighted to introduce you to Sitapati Chandar, graduate of IIT Delhi from the mid 1970s. Spent a very long time at NTPC, and then changed his avatar a little bit. Went to the Asian Development Bank in Manila and spent over a decade out there. And then finally spent a year in the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank in Beijing. And Chandra tells me India is the second largest, equity holder in that bank, after obviously China. And he spent time out there. So cumulatively, over 4 decades of experience in understanding energy security, the issues and the challenges, and potentially has a lot of ideas to tell us at the IITs, what could potentially be done in this country to make India self-secure. Chandar has had variety of roles. I will not go into it. He's been on the boards of several prominent companies, and currently he's advisor, World Energy Council India, and faculty at the NTPC School of Business. So without any, I just have a couple of housekeeping issues. Whatever questions you have, please put them in the Q&A box at the right hand, of your bottom of your screen. Please do not put questions in the chat box, because the chat box is not being monitored for questions and answers. The Q&A box is always being monitored. Myself and my colleague, Dr. Sushila Venkatraman, the two of us are the moderators, and we will monitor the Q&A box. And, so please put all your questions out there. Without any further ado, Chandar, over to you, and walk us through this journey of energy.
Thank you, and thank you, Ashok and Sushila, for this opportunity. So I'd like to thank the IIT Alumni Center for this opportunity to speak today. It's an honor, and I'm very grateful for this. Thank you also, Ashok, for this kind introduction. Well, let's see whether your introduction really lives up to my expectations and the speech. So let's see. Okay, let me share the screen for the slides. Is it visible?
Yes.
Yes, it is. It is. Yeah.
Okay. So let's start. Basically, the subject is one more channel towards the objective of an Atmanirbhar Bharat in energy. I will be briefly touching upon certain emerging technologies and what we are or we are not doing. Because, see, as Ashok mentioned, we have been importing most of our liquid and gaseous hydrocarbons. India imports about 84% of its liquid and gas hydrocarbons. We have now an opportunity to be more self-sufficient by going into renewable energy technologies and renewable energy technology spin-offs. But that would happen only if we develop and progress these technologies. Otherwise, what would happen is we are simply substituting one line of imports, which is commodity imports of hydrocarbons, with another line of imports, which will be technology imports using renewable energy. So it's very important for us to understand what are the issues going ahead and what is it that we think we should do or we can do in order to make ourselves more self-sufficient or Atmanirbhar. So let's start. A brief background. Again, energy is a very vast subject. So in trying to sort of condense it all to a 1 hour talk, I have picked up only the major issues in each segment that I am going to discuss. There are more factors or supporting factors, but these are relatively minor. So it is true that I would not be picking up all the factors in today's discussion. The second I would like to sort of caution is there are or there will be some small movements of change towards the change that I am going to mention. But that's not big enough or serious enough that it can make an impact on the country's energy security or energy outlook. That's why I am raising this. So always there'll be some small lab which is doing something or the other, but we can't take it as a national goal unless there is a national outlook and national effort behind what is going to happen. So let's start. When we discuss any energy issue, we always have three factors to keep in mind. The first is access. Are we giving access to our population? The second is security. Whether once we have given access, can we continue to give this or provide the same commodity or energy resource? Because once we give access to energy, we have changed a lifestyle. There's no going back. It's a one-way ticket. So if we have given access, obviously we have to continue to have the access, and that's what energy security is about. The third is energy sustainability. The third is energy sustainability. Once you have, once you have access, the next issue that we consider is energy sustainability. Essentially, it means that when we have access and we are secure about supplying an energy resource, do we have the ability to keep sustaining that resource supply? And here we look at two broad factors. There are other factors, but I just want to mention two main ones today. The first is environment, whether we can continue to use that energy resource without impacting our environment. And the second is financial, whether the supply of that or the continued supply of that energy resource is financially sustainable as a business. I can give you some examples. For example, we are a big coal usage nation. In fact, we are the second largest coal nation in the world after China. But we clearly see that it's not sustainable from an environment point of view, both locally and globally. Financial, there are some activities that are financially unsustainable in India. A best example of this would be electricity distribution. If you notice our electricity distribution sector, we have been losing close to almost 150,000 crores in the last 2-3 years. And that's again clearly unsustainable. So we come back to the subject of today, which is basically developments in energy supply. And of course, the best developments are those that help address both environment as well as financial sustainability, but also improve energy access and security. Luckily for us, most of the modern renewable energy resources we are discussing helps India in the positive way. It gives India an opportunity to go in a positive direction towards access, security, sustainability, both environment and financial. If you look at our commitments towards the Paris Conference of Parties, basically we are supposed to reduce our energy intensity in the GDP, not necessarily reduce our energy usage, because we are still pretty poor in energy usage per capita. But when we are talking about energy intensity per unit GDP, the main items that come are basically two. The first factor is improving energy efficiency across the board. That means all our energy consuming activities, whether they be industrial, residential, or whatever, have to consume less energy for the same output. The second, and that includes all those in the slide, all these below this, is to produce more renewable energy and use more output of the renewable energy resources to energy consuming activities such as industry or transport and things like that. And we'll come to that. So I am not going to discuss energy efficiency today, because energy efficiency is a large topic by itself, and it consists of multifarious technologies. But we will come back to the balance, which is the actual output of renewable energy and its usage. The first main solar energy costs that we have, we started off with about 15 rupees per kilowatt hour in solar energy production about a couple of years, about 10-15 years back. We are now down to 2 rupees per kilowatt hour. That's a huge reduction. But if you look at the reduction, none of that reduction has originated in India. Most of it, we have just bought technology which has been developed elsewhere. There is hardly any contribution of India to this great development that has taken place. Today, if you look at the solar panels that are installed in India, almost 90% of the cells come from China. We produce only 10% or maybe max 15% of our used solar panels. This is a great dependency. And like I said, instead of importing hydrocarbon, we are basically importing technology products. That's one. The second is, if we hope to become an export house in solar panels, obviously we can't compete, because someone, by just pricing up the raw material by 6-7%, can knock you off the market. So India has never been able to export any solar panels, however big or competitive our production facilities for making modules and panels are, because the base material is controlled by somebody else. Now, what do we do about this? Basically, we have to have production of raw silicon and wafers within India. This is like basic producing steel and cement for our hard infrastructure areas. Without a raw silicon or a wafer industry, you can't have a cost-effective solar panel or a solar industry. Two things we have to keep in mind. One is electricity costs. If you start comparing production prices today, obviously we'll have difficulty competing with the Chinese, because they are established, they are in the market and so on. So somewhere the government and major partners or industries have to take the plunge, to say, I will build large scale raw silicon and wafer production capacity at a price which I can sell, not at a price I can produce. Maybe you take a loss in the first 2-3 years, but then you will make it up because the market is huge. The domestic market in India is huge. The second is finding technology partners. We do not have the basic resources, or we have not established basic research and development capability in this area. And in order to keep up with what is going to happen, because the obsolescence in this area is anything between 3 years and 4 years, we have to have laboratories or investments in research and development that can keep forward our momentum or our lead or place in the international market. For that, you need to start off with technology partners. Almost all major producers of silicon products, cells, they started off with technology partners. And of course, then the government and private sector invested very heavily in research and development facilities to keep up with the world market trends. The second thing we can do, and there is no research on this, is to use less silicon for the same electrical output. Silicon cells, they have different efficiencies for different capital costs. You have the currently used common silicon, monosilicon cells have about 22% conversion efficiency of converting sunlight to electricity. But these cells, there are cells in the lab and in the restricted markets like aerospace and so on, which have up to 32% conversion efficiency, but they are expensive. Now we must have research and development to find out whether A, we can bring down the costs of those kinds of cells, whether we can use those kinds of cells, but use less of them in order to produce the same output. And here is where I come to the next point, which is the concentrated photovoltaic cells. There are technologies where sunlight is concentrated so that, let's say, you don't use full 1:1 sunlight and surface area for generating electricity. Maybe you'll use 1:6, 1:5, but it can go up to 1:15. There are technologies that make it 1:15, but since production costs of silicon and silicon wafers dropped so dramatically, the research and development in this was given up. There is no reason why it can't be taken up again in order to examine whether we can improve our silicon use yield in producing the same electrical output with the same sunlight, but using much less silicon, and therefore cutting down the price of the photovoltaic cells. So two major areas where India needs to look at, examine, and if someone thinks it's worthwhile, we have to apply research money, effort into this if we have to keep our place in the world market. The next big resource that we have is wind electricity or wind energy resources. Again, we started early. We started actually much earlier than even China, Japan, and everybody, because we started in 1988 and China started this seriously only in 1996, 97. But they soon caught up with us, they outstripped us, and now they have even outstripped their original technology suppliers in terms of volumes. For example, I give you most of the Indian or the maximum wind capacity per site capacities in India, the maximum unit is about 2 megawatts. Today, in the world, you have 8 megawatts units which have been delivered and 10 megawatt units which are soon to be delivered. So if you look at the per square meter floor area or space area that we use, it's 10 times more for the same amount of electrical output that is internationally available today. Now, why did we not do this? Because at one point in time, we thought wind was too difficult. Solar was cheaper. It is more amenable to sort of multiple low-cost units, whereas wind is concentrated. So it's too difficult. We just gave up. And now we have dropped behind the rest of the world in both research and development and production capacities. Hence, we have to go back now to the drawing board and see how we can put up units which have higher unit capacities, 8 megawatt, 10 megawatt, and the technologies for that are very different. If you also look at the blade profiles that we use compared to what is being used today, there are differences. Because the blades are bigger, their profiles have to be better. Their engineering in terms of materials are different. So we have lost out on our technology, and therefore we have lost out on our ability to export wind turbines as well, which we used to do at one point in time. In the early 90s, India used to export. Today, no one will buy an Indian machine simply because it's completely out of date. So that's the second is, if you look at all developed countries that have developed their wind energy, they have started onshore, consumed whatever are the eligible sites, and then they have gone offshore. Offshore allows some advantages. There are, of course, higher costs because the cost of foundation supporting the wind turbine is higher. But there are advantages in the sense that you can actually put up much bigger units. The wind is more constant or consistent. Therefore, you get more output per unit. And therefore, you can maximize the capacities of that particular site, the potential capacity of that site. We, with our long shoreline, with our potential for wind on that shoreline, we don't even have a single megawatt of offshore wind today. Every time there is a movement, we do studies, engineering studies, preliminary studies, more preliminary studies, more preliminary studies, but actually we don't get up to investing. It is essential, unless we put up a pilot project of a reasonable size, we will not know. After all, when we are, suppose we were willing to buy electricity at 15 rupees per kilowatt hour from solar initially, and 11 rupees after, we will still have some plants, solar plants selling at 11 rupees per kilowatt hour because of past PPAs. There is no reason why we can't risk 8 rupees per kilowatt hour or 7 rupees per kilowatt hour in looking at offshore winds. So the government and some big companies have to come forward and say, okay, let us develop, say, 500 megawatts of pilot projects based on wind energy offshore at the promising sites that have already been investigated. Then and then only we will know what the real problems are. We will be able to build a supply and construction chain within the country that can improve efficiencies and deliver lower cost output. Otherwise, our 5 rupees or 8 rupees per kilowatt hour in offshore wind, which we are estimating today, will always remain. So that's a problem. The next, battery storage. You will notice that in the last year, we have got models of electric vehicles introduced from outside coming in. And now we have domestic players which are also at the same standard or global standard level. The reason again is protectionism, and I would say some kind of lazy attitude towards developing EVs. Our EVs earlier were not global standard. We could not export them simply because they were not global standards. Our standards were different. Only last year, as part of the MOVE Summit recommendations, India changed its standards to follow European Union standards, as a result of which you have the introduction of the Hyundai Kona, the MG ZS EV, and now our Tata Nexon as well, and some other models which have come out. This would not have been possible 18 months ago because our standards would not have permitted it. And consequently, our volumes of manufacturing will also have been low, that we could not have exported. We would never have had cost breakdown. The second thing we have to keep in mind is that in this business, everybody trades. There is no country which makes everything in the EV business because things have to be made in large volumes. And you can make large volumes only if you have large markets, and you can have large markets only if you have across your markets or across countries. So necessarily, we must have a standard or standardization that goes beyond our country as a market. Now, what constitutes major research in this? First, about 30% or 40% of the car value comes to, only is on the lithium batteries that are there in each car. So obviously our production volumes of this item have to go up if we have to reduce costs. That's one. Second, the limitation of the range anxiety or limitation of an electric vehicle is because it holds much less energy than an equivalent gas tank or a petrol tank of a vehicle, typically only 4 to 5%. And therefore, and because it takes longer to charge, there is an anxiety that once I exhaust my range on my full charge, I'll take a much longer time to get back the range as compared with filling a petrol tank. The answer to that is increasing storage densities through research and development, and this is happening across the world. And countries that believe that they are here for EVs or EVs are here as a mainstay for their transportation needs, they are all investing heavily in research and development on increasing storage densities. It is improving gradually. The lithium ion technology has its limitations. So they are going in for alternative technologies as well. The second problem we have is on the user side. Let us say if we had a battery that could be charged quickly, obviously the electricity that needs to charge the battery has to come from the distribution networks. That means that the distribution networks should have the ability to simultaneously charge a number of vehicles, all demanding higher and higher charging rates. In India, if you look at our distribution system, it is, I would say, its extra available capacity is marginal. Most of the distribution networks, because of the way we price our, we allow for our tariff recovery, has used about 90 to 95% of its distribution capacity margin, which means that if we quickly switch over to large scale electric charging of high capacities, our distribution networks will fail unless we invest very heavily in upgrading them. Broad estimates suggest that if we convert even 60% of our mobility into electricity, EV electric vehicles, it will throw a demand of additionally an 84 gigawatt electricity market onto our distribution networks. Most of the distribution transformers will be overloaded. Most of the distribution low voltage, that is basically the 11 kV and 415 kV networks, would be overloaded. So somewhere we have to think, okay, if these are my cities that I am going to target for usage of electric vehicles, I have to upgrade the distribution networks in these cities. Paradoxically, even in countries which use electric vehicles widely, a few cities, around about 30 cities, account for a major share of the market. This is because they have also realized that in order to invest in electric vehicles, you need to invest in distribution networks. That's a much longer term process. So they've been converting city after city for doing this, plus independent charging stations. And that's been an easier way to do it than to upgrade the entire distribution network in certain cities. Unfortunately, our act in this has been behind time, and we are now only starting to put up charging stations. Very soon we'll realize that there are problems in the distribution network as a result of adding so many charging stations. Finally, research and development into alternative batteries. Today's lithium-ion batteries technology has reached its limit, or will reach its limit very shortly. And if we have to improve the energy capacities on our batteries to enable long distance running and quick charging, we'll have to look at alternative battery technologies. It's there. Only thing is they are all at lab conditions now. There are various stages of experimentation. none has been productized as yet. Again, if we miss out on this, we will be buying these batteries off the shelf from somebody else. So again, it's not an Atmanirbhar Bharat. It will be an importing Bharat, even though we use our electricity generated domestically in-house. In order to use that electricity, we will be importing products which are made elsewhere. So again, something that we need to look at. My final part of the first stage of presentation, I come to hydrogen fuel cells. We realize that electric vehicles have some limitations at the current levels of technology. What are the limitations? One, the battery itself is very heavy. If you look at storage densities, it's about 270 kilowatt hours per ton, which is very high. So if you want to build a truck, a 20-ton truck that travels for long distance, half the weight of the truck carrying capability will be used up in the battery weight itself. This has been a limitation. And the only way to cover that limitation is basically to use hydrogen fuel cells. Hydrogen fuel cells are now big enough, packaged big enough, that you can use them to have even 20, 40-ton trucks going up the standard inclines, and to a range of about 500 kilometers on a single charge of hydrogen. But the hydrogen production and distribution end is a challenge in itself. Hydrogen as a fuel is not an unknown thing. We use it in, for example, our space applications uses a lot of liquid hydrogen as fuel. But the production has been very, very concentrated for one type of use, for production and distribution. If we have to enlarge the production and distribution to cover a wider range of areas or activities or whatever, we need to have a distribution chain that can handle hydrogen. And therefore, we have to go through a full cycle of production of hydrogen through green technologies or green sources. It's storage and distribution, that's through liquefaction and storage. It's transportation as a liquid. And then finally, hydrogen fuel cells based trucks and buses. And also then you have the ability to use it in micro generation, displacing diesel in certain areas. Now, while hydrogen cycle is more expensive today, in areas like Ladakh and Jammu and Kashmir, remote areas, where transport fuel has to come all the way from Panipat, about 800 kilometers road distance, it makes sense. The government, instead of subsidizing diesel transport, can put up some pilot projects based on hydrogen, and that would be an advantage. EVs can't be used for a second reason, that EVs are good only between plus 40 degrees and minus 5 degrees. Less than minus 5, the amount of heating you have to do for the battery to remain efficient itself consumes a lot of energy from the battery. So typically at minus 5, minus 10, EVs are not, let's say, the best alternative used for transport. So hydrogen in that case becomes a very attractive option, especially in very cold areas. So I'll stop at this moment over here. I think it's half an hour. I'll stop and maybe we can take questions. I hand over to Dr. Sushila Venkatraman.
Thank you, Chandar, as always, and a very thought-provoking presentation. So there are a number of questions that have come up. Then I'll start with around solar. So there is a question that someone has asked, what is the maximum efficiency of photovoltaic cells that we have been able to achieve in India?
Okay. Do I answer question by concern, or I note down all the questions and answer?
I can, so that's the one on, I think just that one as far as solar is, so you can answer that. Okay.
We have in the lab, we have developed and usage for space applications, we have used up to 30% energy conversion efficiencies for cells at the cell level. However, commercial applications, we have crossed only 21. So that's where we are today. And this is also universal because we are buying from the world. We are buying whatever is best in the world. So we are at commercially what the world offers. The only problem is we are buying, we are not making it. We are buying the cells from outside. Almost 80 to 90% comes from China.
A couple of questions on wind, and this is to do with setting up of these units. And so one question is that the setting up of windmills requires dedicated area, whereas setting up of solar cells can be put on top of anything, any building or anywhere. So that is one question. And the second question is around what does it cost to actually set up a an offshore wind turbine, especially the foundation to build a wind turbine offshore?
Okay. First, wind versus solar. Solar actually occupies far more land than wind, land area than wind. If you look at, let's say, if you look at current technologies, I think wind uses about 1/8 or 1/7 of the land required for solar. In fact, much less. So that's why when you do large scale solar, you have to use land which has no other alternate use, or you have to put it on top of buildings. But even if you put it on top of buildings, increasingly with vertical height buildings, you find that the amount of solar energy that you produce is only a fraction of your needs. It's only a supplement. It's never a substitute, unless you have a big farmhouse with a big roof that can take care of a wide area of supply. That's also the reason, if you look at solar installations in India, why are most of the installations in, let's say, non-productive farmland areas like Gujarat, Rajasthan? We are now looking at some parts of Tamil Nadu, some parts of Karnataka, Andhra. Basically, they are in poor farmland areas, areas that have low production, farmland production. You cannot put solar on good farmland because that occupies far more space. Wind, on the other hand, has very small footprint. Wind's cost is basically to do with its construction, physical construction, both on the foundation and the pedestal and the equipment that you put onto it. Now, offshore, why do we go offshore? The reason we go offshore is simple. We can put higher capacities offshore than we can put onshore at each location. And because the wind constants in offshore is better. You get more wind productivity offshore than you get onshore because there's nothing to block or make the wind turbulent. So if you are onshore and you get a wind conversion of, let's say, a load factor of 28, offshore, the same installation can go up to 40%. Second, your environment considerations offshore become less because the people will not complain about noise. There is a certain buzz noise when you put on a wind turbine, and offshore, of course, that doesn't impact many people. So that's good. Now, the cost increases offshore simply because you have to put the pedestal, which is under the sea. So typically, you have fixed pedestals if you're less than 50 meters depth, which means that your gradual land area going into the sea has to be shallow. And that limits the number of places where which become eligible for this kind of technology adoption. Or if it's more than, say, 100 meters or so, you go into floating pedestals, which increases the cost, just like your platforms, some of your platforms, oil platforms. But technologies are available, and currently it is estimated that if you put it at the best wind producing sites in India, which is along the Gulf of Mannar and the Palk Straits in Tamil Nadu, and off the coast of Kutch in Gujarat. These are the two best wind producing states in India. You can get, this is the estimate because nobody has done it actually, it's around 8 rupees per kilowatt hour, everything put together. Now, if considering the fact that we were willing to pay for 15 rupees per kilowatt hour when we started our solar program, there is no reason why we should shy away from 8 rupees just because our solar cost now has come down to 2 rupees. People forget that our solar cost has come to 2 rupees simply because we have had a huge scaling up, and therefore costs have dropped down. Balance, even though we import the solar cells, our balance of plant, we have done a lot of R&D. For example, the inverters and the transformers and switchgear, etc. They have been, they are domestically made. And that's what has driven the cost down for solar. And I'm sure if we do this in wind, as has been proven in other countries which do a lot of offshore wind, we can do it in our country also. The only thing is we have to start somewhere, and the starting is always expensive. Yeah, sorry.
So we'll take one more question now, and then we'll come back to the others at the end of the rest of your presentation. And this one is about the life of fuel cells. And the question is, if the fuel cells don't last forever, which they wouldn't, then would we not have an environmental challenge in terms of disposing of dead cells and even solar panels for that matter? So that's one question someone has raised.
Okay. There are two issues in using electricity through batteries and solar equipment. First, yes, solar panels have a life typically of 15 years. It's even less because you're typically going to replace it with an improved solar cell. It comes, even though your existing solar cell might still have a technical life validity. So since you're going to replace it, its life is typically 10 to 12 years, not more than that. We do need to build recovery plants or recycling plants in large numbers. Just like when we started producing mercury bulbs, those tube lights, we did not build our recycling plants, or when we built our lead acid batteries, we do not have good recycling plants, and therefore they went into the environment creating problems, leachate problems. We are going to end up with problems in using large scale solar cells, solar panels, if we do not have recycling plants in place. And that's one area where definitely we need to work on. Now, coming back to fuel cells versus batteries. The battery life in a car is 6 to 8 years. 8 years is a good life for an electric vehicle battery. So compared to that, the fuel cell is actually longer, lasts longer. So if you are comparing electric vehicles versus fuel cells, the fuel cells actually are comparable in terms of life. Fuel cells also are probably easier to recycle. We have never used fuel cells in such large numbers that we know what the problems are. Abroad, where they've used a bit more, I mean, no country has used hydrogen fuel cells in such mass supply that they have realized what it takes. So it is an emerging issue, I would say. But compared to known problems of batteries and solar panels, this is supposed to be less. So that's my answer, I would say.
Thanks, Chandar. You could continue with the rest of your talk.
Okay. Let me go back now on my presentation. It's a peculiar thing. I'm going back, and now I'm going to cover things in a little more detail. So that's the sequence now that we know a little bit of what we are trying to do. Okay. Two things I left out in my initial round of presentations. The first was when I talked about sustainability, I didn't touch upon the financials. I just mentioned that there are huge distribution losses in India. The problem is, if you look at India's handling of its infrastructure, almost all developed countries, they make money from hard infrastructure to spend on soft infrastructure. For example, they make money on the networks, transportation sector. They make money on the electricity or energy sector, global whole. They make money on the water sector and then spend it on the health and education sectors. This is typically what's done. We are, and this is true of China as well. if you look at the Chinese electricity market, energy market, etc., there are no subsidies. What they subsidize is not the process or the service. They subsidize the end consumer. If I am poor and I consume electricity, I am subsidized. The electricity is not subsidized. Unfortunately, in our system, we tend to subsidize a service, not the end consumer, and finally end up by subsidizing people who don't need subsidies. Like, for example, when you make 200 units in Delhi, for example, 200 units of electricity for use for residential consumers is priced lower than what it costs to make and distribute. You're subsidizing everybody. You're subsidizing even people who don't need it. The same was true of LPG cylinders, and which luckily we have now got out of. And now we have converged the prices between subsidized and non-subsidized. There is a huge need for us to rethink this problem, because funding of a sector is not just finding the capital for it, it's also to find the money for running it well. And if you're more and more dependent on your energy networks, whether it is be electricity, whether it is be gas, liquid fuel, you have to be able to run it in a commercial manner with a certain progression on investments. That's what is required. And therefore, we should rethink of how we price. We should not be subsidizing services. We should be subsidizing the end user. That's one. The second is that when we look at our markets, whether it is access to security or whatever, we have to think of how we integrate into the global chain. We are not doing it. We are talking in terms of the Indian market quite inward. There are many companies, of course, that are looking at export market, but not in a way that integrates its internal and external markets. If you look at OECD countries, typically Japanese or even the Chinese, Koreans, etc., for them there is no differentiation. The differentiation is very minor between an internal market and an external market. In fact, it's the other way around. The internal market seems to subsidize the external market, unlike ours, where we protect the internal market and allow the external market to die. So that's one thing that we have to, and this attitude governs our viewpoint of whether to invest in research and development, etc., because we simply don't have the resources. We have run out of resources. I can bring another example. If we are thinking that we are losing money heavily in the energy sector, we are losing money even more in the water sector. Energy is basically a federal or a central government plus a state government jurisdiction. So we know typically. Water is a third tier. It's more of a municipality and a local Gram Panchayat issue. So what we need to invest in our water sector to make it sustainable is actually anybody's guess. We don't even know. And that is the root cause of our problem. Because we are subsidizing services, we are not subsidizing people. Now let's come to some of these issues that we discussed earlier in a broad term. Energy efficiency. Again, if you look at energy efficiency, some sectors in India have done extremely well. For example, our steel sector. Our steel sector is now one of the more energy efficient sectors, and globally also, it's quite competitive. The same is true of our cement sector. Most of our private sector cement plants are up to the efficiency standards globally and or are investing enough to get there. And that's a good thing. That's two major sectors. But if you look at our other sectors, typically the building sector, there is a major need for an overall of energy efficiency built into the design and use of buildings. And this is something that we have to really look at quite seriously. Two other sectors I would mention which are large consuming. One is pulp and paper. Our pulp and paper needs improvement in terms of energy efficiency. And of course, thermal power plants. Our generation of energy itself is inefficient. A comparison again, we love to compare ourselves with China. In China today, nobody can put up a coal-fired power plant of less than 500 megawatts, which is not supercritical. Simply because they don't allow it. It's not, you will not get a license. If you look at the way they have moved their efficiencies in the thermal generation sector, it has moved dramatically because they have not only added, everybody talks about China adding 200,000 megawatts in coal-fired generation over the last 10 years. What they don't see is that they have also decommissioned about 60,000 megawatts. All 50 megawatt, 100 megawatt, 200 megawatt, most subcritical items have been decommissioned. They will not run. And hence there is a dramatic shift in the energy efficiency use of even coal-fired power plants in China as compared with India. Here we are, for a variety of reasons, some of which is basically employment related, or we have not decommissioned our old units, which are far from optimal in terms of energy efficiency and in terms of other things like employment as well. But that's another matter. But if you look at energy efficiency benchmarks, we have a long way to go. We have to move in this direction. Luckily, since we have taken a decision not to build many more coal-fired units, I think the time has come to now really start seriously thinking, how do we decommission the ones that are poor in energy efficiency, thereby pushing up India's bar, energy efficiency bar. And that's something that we really need to look at. In terms of battery storage, we have some collaborations. I have seen Exide and Amara Raja getting into collaborations with foreign counterparts for making lithium-ion batteries. But it's still much, much lower than what our targeted expected use of lithium-ion batteries in electric vehicles is. And if you add grid storage requirements, which also we will be using in increasingly large numbers, if we are adding intermittent solar and wind resources, this is going to be huge. Another major opportunity for India to ramp up its thinking and put up production units. We are not doing it. But once you do that, we come into another problem. If we have got large-scale lithium-ion battery production, where does the lithium come from? Or where do the raw materials come from? Or even EVs, for example, on the permanent magnets, we need scarce resource materials. So we have to think about this and get our entire chain, our manufacturing chain in order. And we will know this only if we are putting up larger and larger scale units rather than the small units that we are now thinking of putting up and tinkering with. If you look at the largest manufacturing for solar panels in China, it will be about 10,000 megawatts at one place. Our largest is around 2,000 megawatts at best, and that's only in one place. The rest are all less than 500. So obviously we cannot compete in scale when we are thinking this way. And therefore we say, yeah, yes, it's cheaper to import from China, let's import from China. And this goes on and on. So this is a problem. The same is true of wind installations. We have to get into materials science. We have to get into technologies. We have to get into higher reliability issues for wind. And that requires bigger laboratories, bigger research and development expenditures. And that's something we have to look at. Let's look at hydrogen fuel cells. I come back to the example I gave about the heavy transports being on hydrogen fuel cells. If you look at Ladakh, I just give an example. It's an area that's interesting. Ladakh is a high altitude desert. Therefore, it hardly gets rain. It gets 300 plus days of sunshine a year. Ideal conditions, low population, therefore ideal conditions for solar energy development. The problem is there is nobody to consume the kind of energy that you can put up in Ladakh. Let's say if it's got 4,000, 5,000 megawatts of capacity, solar potential, there's hardly any demand for it. So what do? The best place for it is to convert that into green hydrogen by electrolysis. Luckily, you have water in Ladakh by way of many rivers. You convert that into hydrogen And since fuels, automotive fuels are brought in from Panipat, which is about 800 kilometers away, it's a good substitute. Even if it's an expensive substitute, it's a good substitute. And it will bring down costs. And more important, it will be an incubator for us to learn how to run a hydrogen cycle on a micro basis. Just like we put in a lot of money and effort into doing micro sites before we went into large scale solar or large scale wind. And now we are going into hybrid wind solar storage integration, which is something that we are now attempting. Like that, it needs a large scale pilot for looking at all these aspects of technologies before you can put it to work. Trucks are available, although only one or two manufacturers, maybe two manufacturers across the world are now making hydrogen fuel cell based trucks. Toyota is one of them, and there is another company which is based out of the US. I forget the name. Anyway, so there are two. Hyundai is making some buses, smaller buses based on hydrogen fuel cells. So the utilization is available now commercially. What we don't have internally is the electrolysis cycle, the cooling liquefaction cycle, and the storage cycle. If we have that, and then we have at least tested whether this technology can be used gainfully in India or not. So that's one. Next, coming to the usage of, let's say, balancing, H2 as a balancing fuel. Once we decide that H2 can be used in an area like Ladakh, most of Ladakh's remote villages run on diesel today. Again, with very high costs of production. The production is on excess of 15 to 18 rupees per kilowatt hour. It's only because the government subsidizes it that it's either free or it's priced at 2 rupees, 1 rupee, something like that. So ideal market for hydrogen distribution if we can do it. If you have a hydrogen production and storage center, not only can it be used for fuel, for transport, it can be used also for microgrid stabilization. And then you can add whatever you like. Once you have a stable source of energy supply, you can supplement it with wind and solar on an intermittent basis, and it will be able to run a decent grid. So this is again something that we need to look at. We went into reduction of solar energy costs. Now, why did I talk about concentrated PV? The reason is, if we are able to use even, we know that we have a problem of setting up large scale facilities, or we may have a reluctance to set up large scale manufacturing facilities because simply we may be afraid of taking on global competition at this point in time. But one way we can beat it is by using higher capacity or higher conversion efficiency cells which are available in the market more efficiently by using less of it to feed the same amount of ground area. We were quite good at solar thermal. If you'll notice, we had a lot of solar thermal installations in Rajasthan and Gujarat on a pilot basis before solar PV became so cheap that solar thermal dropped out of the market. Technologies which are hybrid. We can use the concentrators of the old solar thermal units, combine them with high efficiency solar PV technology to produce electricity which is cheaper and more importantly, which uses less silicon, thereby making our limited silicon resources go further, also avoiding a recycling problem, a bigger recycling problem. So that's something we can look at. Okay, I'm still on. We did this. I've talked about this, so I don't want to talk about this anymore. Okay, now distribution networks. We come to distribution networks. If you look at most of the developed countries, I mentioned that there are few cities around which electric vehicle development has been, or electric vehicle usage has been concentrated. And typically, if you look at the top 15 to 20 cities in the world, they take in about 50% of all the electric vehicles sold. It's not that everywhere in America that the electric vehicles are so common, or everywhere in Britain or Norway, even where electric vehicles are very common. it's there. It's no. It's focused around a few cities simply because only a few cities have the distribution networks that can handle this kind of mass charging. There, we also have to now select. In the past, we had ideas about, I will put up, let's say, facilities around Delhi or Bangalore or Mumbai, depending on the whims of certain decision makers. But once you do this, we have to have an ecosystem. After all, a distribution entity recovers money from the electricity it sells through its network. So if you have upgraded the distribution facility, you must have takers to take up the extra capacity that has been created, which means that you must have an ecosystem of EV usage in that particular area where you are upgrading. Similarly, to introduce mass EVs, you must have a distribution network that can support the mass EV usage. So initially, at least, there's a need for integrated planning. Secondly, if you go to use EVs across the country for cross-city usage, you must also have intermediate points where appropriate fueling or appropriate charging facilities, quick charging facilities are available. So let's say, for example, you start off with Delhi. You should have Delhi as a focus. And then let's say Delhi, Chandigarh, Delhi, Lucknow, or Delhi, Kanpur, Jaipur. You must have enough charging stations that a person can comfortably, without feeling the anxiety, be able to travel, charge, and come back. The same is true if you're doing a southern hub like Bangalore. You have to have Bangalore, Mysore, Bangalore, Chennai, Bangalore, maybe some local areas within, say, 300, 400 kilometers, all of which are equipped for electric vehicles to travel comfortably and come back. This means that we need to integrate the distribution network thinking with EV development. And that's, again, a challenge. We are so siloed even today, even between major facets of our development, that it's very difficult for us to think that the transportation sector can coordinate with the electricity sector or the energy sector. And in the energy sector, we need to have, let us say, the liquid hydrocarbons sector coordinating with the electricity sector, because some of the petrol dispensation, petrol pumps need to now be converted purely into electric charging facilities, because you will not be selling that amount of hydrocarbon fuels anymore. That's something. Abroad, when you think about smart cities, the smartness is not just in adding meters to measure kilowatt hours or bar or whatever that we are thinking. The smartness is in coordinating that information between industries. For example, in Japan, if you look at the two so-called advanced smart cities of Yokohama and Kitakyushu, the sewage, the water supply and sewage department, the transport department, and the electricity department all share the same database, so that you're using the least amount of energy to deliver all these services in an integrated manner. That requires a lot more thinking and a lot more investment in certain technologies, which includes not only just energy provision technologies, but also telecommunication technologies, because on a real-time basis, this is being coordinated. So you have house coordination, you have area coordination, and you have across the board sector coordination going all the time on real time. This requires enormous telecommunication backbone, a wireless telecommunication backbone. And I don't know, I mean, whether we have the vision, whether we can do it on a pilot basis, even in a small city. We started off with Puducherry as being one of our pilot smart cities, but just stopped at doing electricity measurements and saying we have reached the degree of smartness, which is not so. I mean, of course, there is no definition of what constitutes a smart city, but definitely if you look at smart cities elsewhere and smart cities here, even our attempt has not been to convert our cities into any great degree of smartness. So I think we have pegged our objectives itself pretty low. So that's something that we need to look at. Our vision needs to change. On hydrogen fuel cells, And an area which I didn't discuss in detail has been electrolysis. Now, electrolysis, there are various technologies. I didn't want to mention it because I didn't know how much time I would have. There are three broad types of electrolysis technologies. And of course, each has its own costs and efficiencies. The last of these three, which can use even what we call dirty water or seawater. And that has a great potential because not only are we generating hydrogen, you're also generating clean water as a byproduct. You can generate clean water as a byproduct. And if you look at our coastal cities, there are some cities on the coast which are water stressed or water short. At least for drinking purposes, this could be a good, let us say, combinational technology of producing energy along with clean water. And that's something that we need to look at. So I'll stop here once more and maybe take questions again. Over to you, Sushila.
Yeah.
Or is it Ashok? Sorry. Over to you, Ashok.
Yeah, thanks, Chandar. Thank you so much. So I think if you, this India consumes about what, 400 gigawatts of power?
Yeah, that's about our installed capacity right now.
So this is one data point. The second data point is, I think energy is approximately 5.5 to 6.5% of GDP. If you
it's a little more. What is important is not percent of GDP. It's our consumption level is still at about 1100 kilowatt hours per person per year, which is way below even the average, world average, and definitely below, you might say, even middle industrial country average, which is around 2,500 to 3,000 kilowatt hours per person per year.
Yeah, so I'm saying that, as the GDP increases, your consumption of energy will definitely go up.
Yes, it will go up.
Right, and if you see the skew towards services,
yeah,
a lot of energy goes into services rather than agriculture or industry.
Actually, by going into services, we have saved energy because our kind of services are energy light in that sense. Okay. We are not operating major data centers or telecommunication hubs as you look at when you look at services in the US or UK or
the farms. You mean the data farms?
Exactly. Yeah. We are not doing that.
Yeah.
Basically, we are providing back office support, and we are calling that services. Yeah. So that is not a major energy consumer. I mean, it is an energy consumer, but it's not so much as industry. If we had industrialized in the right sense or in the sense that we are now talking about, we would have ended up consuming far more energy, which is what China did.
Yeah. So if you look at, potentially a vision over, let's say, your talk is on Atmanirbhar. How do we become self-reliant over the longer term?
Yeah.
And over the longer term means you're saying, look at the possibilities of solar, wind, hydrogen fuel cells, and look at derivatives like the automotive industry and ensure that industry consumes non-hydrocarbon types of fuels. So what this will do is skew our market so that, Coal India generates whatever 100 million tons of coal, and they employ so many people. So I think there's a need to balance usage of type of fuel to potential economic, unemployment issues and so on and so forth. So if we were to create a blueprint over the next 10 to 15 years, what would that blueprint look like is, I think, the larger question. Because if I look at the Q&A box, everyone's asking subsets of that. You're now saying we are buying hydrocarbons and we'll continue to buy technology. So when do you shift from a buy versus make, logic?
Okay. Let me come to first the underlying factors, and then we'll build upon it.
Yeah.
See, certain factors are inevitable. We have to face them. If we don't face them today, or we refuse to face them today, we will be facing them tomorrow, and with much more dramatic consequences. For example, coal. When I talked about energy access, energy security, and energy sustainability, the first two are very local. If you go ask your local MLA or MP to get votes, he will say, I need access because all my constituents, if they get access, they are happy, they will vote for me. They have to be secure because once you're provided energy, the lifestyle changes, the equipments that are used changes. And if you don't supply it anymore, then I'm going to have a riot in my hands. Therefore, I need security. These two are very clear, they're very local. When it comes to sustainability, there are two factors. One is, if you look at environment sustainability, it has a local dimension and a global dimension. And if you look at financing, it has a local dimension and I would use the term local global dimension because sometimes it's not the state or the municipality. It is the center which takes or bears the brunt of a mistake which is done at state level. We have done this very often. I mean, we fudge numbers so coolly that sometimes it's very difficult to make out who has made the blunder because someone else is paying for it. Okay. Now, as long as the local problem does not surface, or rather a global problem does not surface to a local problem, nobody is going to make an effort to change it. And this has been an effort. We have seen this. Okay, agriculture gets zero energy, zero cost electricity. So what happens? He uses water intensively in areas which are water short. Now, as long as water is free and electricity is free to keep on pumping up the water table that keeps going down, nobody bothers. The moment you start running out of water because essentially you're mining water, everybody starts complaining. We have a major serious problem now on our hands. Okay. Then people start looking at what was the mistake. The mistake is subsidizing. Actually, you have created a perverse incentive to consume more water because you're subsidizing both water and electricity into something which is not sustainable. I had a lot of work done in Gujarat in the late 90s and early 2000s, which led to a lot of major changes. And one of the issues we faced was dropping water tables, and I have actually dealt with a lot of villagers firsthand in trying to convince them it's in their interest that water and electricity are both priced, because then you use it in a manner which goes for higher returns, not doing crops which are highly water and energy consuming. And it was done. I mean, that's another matter. So this is one. In environment also, the same problem comes. As long as a global problem remains a global problem, we don't care. As long as a global problem becomes a local problem, somehow everybody then starts focusing attention. Take Delhi's smog, for example. This stubble burning and consumption used to go on when we were children. I mean, it's going on forever. It's a traditional Indian practice to burn stubble. Why is it becoming serious now? Because Delhi has grown in population. There are other factors which are now combining with this to make it an unhealthy place. So a global problem has become a local problem now. So everybody is now focused on how to sort it out. This occurs, I just gave you two examples, this occurs across the board. Now, a smart society is one that foresees this and acts before it actually comes. Because when it comes, you have probably the wrong people taking the decisions. And because it's at gunpoint virtually, you are probably making a mistake of over-investing and not having the pace to look back and seeing whether you're doing the right solution or not. And that's something, again, we have to look at. I mean, someone goes to court, the court decrees that, yeah, Delhi will get rid of all its diesel buses and so, whether Delhi can afford it or not is another matter. Because it's someone else's business to provide the money. The same is happening now with us in all the shifts that are occurring. So in coal also, we have to recognize that there is an end game which is coming from 2 points of view. One, we already consume about 350 to 400 million tons a year. We are the second largest consumers of coal after China. And incidentally, for just a data point, Coal India is the largest mining and distribution coal company in the world by far. Okay. Can we keep on consuming this level? Obviously not, for two reasons. One, as long as our other fuels were imported fuels, it made sense to say that there is an indigenization angle to this. But with renewable energy increasingly going into the mix, you cannot say you're importing sunshine or you're importing wind. So that argument falls away. The second is, as long as technology keeps improving to give you returns which are lower cost, the second argument that coal is cheaper or coal produced products are cheaper also falls away. Then you are left with only the subsidy angle. Yes, I have employment. And then the issue comes like any other industry, like we have so many of our generation facilities, coal-fired generation facilities, which are idle but employ workers. They have no output, but there are many workers attached. If you want to have this hanger-on kind of attitude from governments, that's fine. I mean, that will also last for some time. But since someone is paying for it, at the end of the day, it'll come to a choice issue. Should I pay for this as compared with something else? And obviously, then the pressure comes. Okay, let's shift this to education, or let's shift this to health, and we will see. So the sooner we recognize this and the sooner we sort of act accordingly to bring it down ourselves in a gradual manner, it's like, I mean, as they say in engineering, the most efficient process is the quasi-static process. So if we adopt a quasi-static process over a long time, we probably end up with more efficient results than if we do a dramatic step up or step down, as the case may be, and spend money on it in a dramatic manner.
So some of the questions are on other forms of energy that you have not covered. Just wondering if you would care to comment on wave energy. IIT Madras probably still has a center for ocean engineering.
Yeah.
And also some other person has asked about biofuels as two other, so what would your reactions be to both these other alternate forms?
Okay. Wave energy has seen very few applications simply because the parameters that give it are that let's say that are required to make it cost efficient are very, very limiting, and that's what has stopped it from being developed in a large way in most of the countries. There were facilities developed in France and Korea, and both have not reported encouraging results. Even if you scale up or improve the efficiency parameters, it has to go a long way before something can happen. I'm not saying we shouldn't invest in that, but then there has to be a very clear pathway to say this can be improved through technology, this efficiency aspect can be improved through technology, and then you invest in it. That's somehow not there in the wave energy technology. So that's one reason why globally it's not taken off, let's say. That's one. Coming back to biogas, okay.
Biofuels, really.
Biofuels, okay. Biofuels have two problems.
Ethanol.
Yeah. Can I say, as long as we can say that biofuels will not compete with food security, here we are now coming up against one security of one kind versus another security. Typically, biofuels have had this problem, and I will cite the example of the Philippines as being one of the most glaring examples, I would say. Bioethanol, the only positive cycle production without subsidies that is cheaper is through sugarcane. Sugarcane is the base for this. Now, unfortunately, sugarcane is also a food crop or a food export crop, if you want to use it that way. And countries that are large sugarcane producers like Brazil, like the Philippines, have bioethanol production based on sugarcane. Now, as long as you can keep this within limits that it does not restrict your ability to provide the sugar or the the food grain that are required for our healthy consumption, that's fine. But the moment they start conflicting, then you have a problem. Now, luckily, biodiesel is supposed to use plants that are not food grain competitive plants. They are used on marginal land. If that is so, that's fine. But I don't see that as being a very large scale usage. The second problem with biofuels is that your production facilities need a steady supply of raw materials. Now in India, on the few places it's been done, the moment the farmer realizes that that production facility is dependent on his supply, he invariably jacks up the price. And therefore, what used to be a financially viable production center, bottom drops off. So,
what about solid oxide fuel cells like Bloom Energy?
Okay, I don't know too much about them or their potential, so I am not in a good position to answer this question. Clearly, let's say they are not popular in the sense more work needs to be done about it. Let's put it that way. Yeah.
Okay. So one of your roles at ADB was in financing and also in the infrastructure. Our financing schemes in India, I mean, I think it's very expensive. Right? Our interest rates are on the higher side and so on and so forth. So if you were to have a sustained investment in the energy sector over the next 10, 15 years, would there be good sources of investment that would make us competitive? This is part A of the question. And part B, what I'm trying to do is club questions from multiple people into one so that you can answer it. The second part is, while generating power is one thing, but you also need transmission, load management, switch gear, there's that transformers and the rest. So that whole mix need to be financed from generation to transmission to consumption. How does one go about making that an efficient engine?
Okay. As far as the transmission side of our business, let me take the second question first. It's easy to answer. Yeah. As long as you make the energy source conventional, like electricity, we can handle it. India has had a long track record and our electricity industry is mature enough that we can handle this. What spoils the mix actually is policy intervention. Our entire policy of subsidizing services rather than the end user has created problems in many sectors. And electricity is the most glaring because it's the least commercial, most government dominated, or rather its history has been the most government dominated. It was easy to put this in the forefront of the subsidies. And that's what is causing the problem today. If we get out of it, see, there is a difference between funding and financing. When you fund something, you find the capital expenditure. When you finance something, it has to pay back the whole cycle has to be completed, which means that what you fund has to pay back the capital as well as the interest and the operating costs and make money at the end of it. This has been our problem. Government has always found funding to be an easier solution than financing. The interest rates actually do not make too much of a difference as long as our policies are consistent and we recognize that certain sectors have to run on a commercial basis. I have financed projects even in countries like Afghanistan, where there are no capital markets and it's very nascent and the laws are all hazy. But the project itself was financeable in the sense that it was not only fundable, it was also financeable. And it's gone very well. I mean, if you look at the telecom sector in Afghanistan, it's from 0 to 22 million consumers in something like 15 years, all cell phones, because wires are not easy to draw. So it can happen. My lowest IPP costs I've seen in Asia are in Bangladesh, actually, which has a worse financing profile than India. But they also treat that the electricity as a commercial commodity. The subsidy goes to the end user, not to the service. So everybody knows how to plan, how to extract the last degree of optimization. So if you look at the distribution losses in Bangladesh, even in the rural areas, they were always better than India's, simply because it's money. I mean, it's a money issue. So that just broadly sort of answers your question.
Anyway, there are more questions, but we have very little time. I think For our viewers, this recording of this webinar will be available on the IIT Alumni Center Bengaluru YouTube channel on Monday morning. Sushila, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chandar. A very comprehensive and a very thought-provoking presentation today. Thank you very much. And thank you so much for so readily agreeing to take this up. We had a presentation 2 weeks ago on Atmanirbhar Bharat, which was focusing on manufacturing. And we really felt that energy is an area we should look at as a follow-up to that discussion. And so thank you once again. Just a few takeaways and a summary of what we've been through today. We looked at 4 aspects. We looked at solar, wind, electric vehicles, and hydrogen fuel cells broadly. We started with Chandar explaining the trilemma, as he called it, of the whole issue of energy around access, security, and sustainability. And when we looked at sustainability, it was more both about financial sustainability and the environment. And as Chandar explained, for us in India, we are fortunate that the new energy options actually are all aligned for us in such a way that we can move forward and meet all of these challenges going forward simultaneously. Several imperatives that he brought out, the first one being vision. And we need to think at scale, we need to think long-term, and we need to think both national and global, as well as, apart from, of course, the local considerations. He highlighted the fact that we need national commitment to all aspects of the energy conundrum. It's not just looking at one aspect which might be convenient at a particular point of time, but in this whole context of the vision. The second important issue was making sure that the standards we set for ourselves are international standards and nothing less than international standards. The third point was about thinking ecosystems and really all inclusive. So, looking at allied or complementary areas. So he talked about, for example, the relationship between energy and water as a sector and why we should think of them simultaneously rather than thinking only of one of them at a time. And then he highlighted a number of R&D areas. That's very significant because of the fact that our technology is outdated. The technology in these areas is evolving very, very rapidly. And of course, imports are very costly. As he put it, from importing coal, etc., the hydrocarbon fuels, from there, what we're going to shift to is to importing technology, unless we really invest now in these different R&D areas. And he highlighted specific ones, including things like materials and improving the efficiency of all kinds of processes, including things like quick charging and cell efficiency and all of that. And the final point I thought was a holistic view of the sector, of the energy sector, whether it's generation, distribution, consumption, raw materials, the whole process, all of that put together, but thinking holistically about the sector as a whole. There were a few very interesting ideas that came up. One of them was Ladakh as an incubator to learn about using hydrogen fuel. And we saw the logic and it's a great thought and large scale pilot, but one that would put all aspects together. The second one was about microgrids and how hydrogen as a fuel can actually help the whole idea of microgeneration. Recovery and recycling plants and why they are important, why they need to come into place, energy efficiency, improving the energy efficiency of various other sectors. So we have, for example, cement and steel that are good, but we still have our buildings that consume huge amounts of energy for no good reason, and pulp and paper and so on. We also had a very wide-ranging discussion about policies. and even issues such as subsidies and so on. So we've had a very interesting discussion, I believe. And Chandar, once again, thank you ever so much for being here. And thanks to all of our participants for being here and for your questions and discussions. So thank you.
Thank you, Sushila. Thank you, Ashok. And once again, thanks for the opportunity. I think it's an honor to speak at this platform. So I'm very grateful for the invitation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chandar.